Eleanor Hartley did not cry when Dale Rourke looked her up and down on that boardwalk and said loud enough for half of Ash Hollow to hear, "I can't marry that." She did not cry when the laughter started, when women covered their mouths, when men looked away. She stood with her trunk at her feet, and her spine straight as a fence post, and she did not give a single one of them the satisfaction of a single tear. But inside, God help her, something cracked that would take a long time to mend. If this story already has your heart, subscribe to this channel and follow every part to the end. Drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. The stagecoach from Dodge City pulled into Ash Hollow on a Wednesday morning, which Eleanor Hartley would later consider the cruelest kind of timing. A Wednesday, the very middle of the week, the day that belonged to nobody. The day that promised nothing in either direction. She had been traveling for 11 days. 11 days of dust in her teeth and the smell of other people's sweat and the constant lurching sway of a coach that seemed determined to rattle every bone loose from her body. She had eaten hard bread and dried beef and drunk water that tasted faintly of iron. She had slept sitting up with her head against the window frame and woken each morning with a crick in her neck that she worked out slowly with her fingers while the Kansas plains unrolled outside the glass flat, and endless and the color of old wheat. She had done all of this without complaint. Eleanor Hartley had never been a woman who complained. She stepped down from the coach onto the Ash Hollow boardwalk with her trunk in hand, wearing her best dress. Deep blue wool, pressed the night before at the last inn, and her hair pinned as neatly as 11 days of travel would allow. She had a letter in her coat pocket, folded and refolded until the creases had gone soft. The letter from Dale Rourke, dated 6 weeks prior, written in a tight, careful hand. "I look forward to your arrival. We will build something proper here." Those were his exact words. She had memorized them. The town of Ash Hollow was not large. One main street, a general store, a livery, a church with a crooked steeple, a saloon that was already doing business even at this hour. Maybe 300 people, she guessed, though several dozen of them appeared to be gathered near the front of Rourke's Mercantile, the largest building on the block, its sign freshly painted and visible from half a street away. She recognized Dale Rourke from the photograph her brother Victor had sent. Tall, sandy-haired, somewhere in his mid-40s, with a neat mustache, and the kind of posture that came from years of believing yourself important. He was standing on the top step of his store's entrance, speaking with 2 other men, and when the stagecoach arrived, he turned and looked. Eleanor squared her shoulders. She picked up her trunk. She walked toward him. She watched his face as she approached, and she catalogued what she saw there because she had learned in 32 years of living in a body that the world felt entitled to judge, to read a man's face before he opened his mouth. She saw recognition first. Yes, she matched the description, or perhaps the photograph Victor had sent. Then she saw something move behind his eyes, something she had seen before in other men's faces, something that lived in the space between expectation and disappointment. She kept walking. She stopped 3 feet from the bottom step and looked up at him. "Mr. Rourke," she said. "I'm Eleanor Hartley. I believe you've been expecting me." The 2 men beside him said nothing. Dale Rourke looked at her for a long moment. Not at her face. At her. The full length of her. The kind of look that was not a greeting. "Miss Hartley," he said, and then, loud enough for the small crowd that had gathered, loud enough for the women near the dry goods window, and the men loitering by the hitching post, and the children chasing a dog near the alley, loud enough for all of them. He said, "I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding." Eleanor did not move. "A misunderstanding?" she repeated. "The arrangement your brother described." He paused, and she could hear something almost like discomfort in him, though not the right kind, not the kind that came from conscience. "It's not going to be possible. I'm sorry you made the journey." The silence that followed was enormous. "Not going to be possible," Eleanor said. Her voice was level. She had always had that, at least a voice that did not shake, even when everything underneath it was shaking. "Can you tell me why?" He looked at her again, that same look, and this time he didn't bother to conceal what it meant. "I think you're a capable woman," he said. "I'm sure you'll find your situation." Someone near the dry goods store laughed a short, quickly swallowed sound. Someone else whispered something to their companion. Eleanor did not look away from Dale Rourke's face. "I came 11 days on that coach," she said. "I came with a letter you wrote that said, 'Letters say a great many things.'" He adjusted his coat. "Good day, Miss Hartley." He went back inside his store. And Eleanor Hartley stood on that boardwalk with her trunk at her feet, in her best blue dress in a town that had just decided to know exactly what kind of woman she was, based on a 30-second look from a man she had never met, and she did not cry. She turned around slowly and looked at the street. Faces looked back at her, or quickly looked away. A woman in a yellow bonnet murmured something behind her hand to another woman. A man near the post hitched up his belt and spat. 2 boys on the steps of the saloon were grinning. Eleanor picked up her trunk. She turned in the direction of what appeared to be a boarding house based on the sign 2 buildings down. She walked toward it. Her steps were measured and deliberate, and she kept her eyes forward, and she gave no one the satisfaction of watching her face fall apart. Inside, something cracked, but she had plenty of practice keeping the inside separate from the outside. The boarding house was run by a woman named Mrs. Potts, who was in her 60s and had the look of someone who had seen most of what the world had to offer and found it only mildly interesting. She rented Eleanor a room the size of a large closet for 75 cents a night and told her the bath was down the hall and supper was at 6, no exceptions. Eleanor sat on the edge of the narrow bed and read Dale Rourke's letter again. Then she folded it very carefully and held it in both hands and stared at the wall. "We will build something proper here." She thought about the 11 days on the coach. She thought about the letter she had sent to her brother Victor from Dodge City, the last stop before Ash Hollow arrived Wednesday. "I am nervous, but hopeful." She thought about the way Victor had written back immediately, unusually quickly for Victor, with cheerful reassurances. "Rourke is a good man. You'll have a fine life." She had believed him because Victor was her brother, and she had not yet learned all the ways a brother could fail you. She set the letter down on the bed. She pressed her palms flat against her knees. She would not stay in this room. She could not afford to stay in this room. 75 cents a night would exhaust her savings in 3 weeks, and she had no guarantee of income and no acquaintances in this town, and no plan beyond the one that had just collapsed in front of her on a public boardwalk. She would need to think. Eleanor Hartley had always been good at thinking, even when, perhaps especially when, there was nothing comfortable to think about. The next morning she was up at 5, dressed and out of the boarding house before Mrs. Potts had put coffee on. She walked the full length of Ash Hollow's main street, twice taking inventory. There were 6 businesses that might conceivably need help. The general store, which she would not enter, the hotel, the livery, the saloon, a small restaurant called Nettie's, and a seamstress shop. She went to each of them in order and asked plainly and without apology whether they had need of reliable help. The hotel said no. The livery said no without looking at her. The saloon said something she chose not to repeat. Nettie at the restaurant looked at her with something approaching sympathy and said she'd had to let her last girl go because business was thin and she couldn't afford anyone new just yet. The seamstress said she would think about it. Eleanor thanked each of them and went back to her room and ate the piece of bread she'd wrapped in cloth from last night's supper and thought about what came next. What came next arrived at mid-morning in the form of a conversation she was not supposed to hear. She had gone to the general store for supplies, not Rourke's, the smaller dry goods place at the north end of the street, run by a Mr. Fenner. A small, quiet man who appeared to have no opinion about her whatsoever, which she found immensely restoring. She was examining the price of flour when 2 women came in, talking the kind of talking that does not lower its volume because it has not yet registered who else is present. "Hale Ranch, you know how he is, hasn't hired anyone since Martha died, and the place is showing it. Poor man, and Elias just sitting in that back room. 3 years. You'd think by now. He needs help. Lord knows he needs help. But you know how Grayson is, too proud to ask. Someone ought to just show up out there." Eleanor put down the flour. She turned toward the women. They noticed her and stopped talking the way people in small towns do when they remember a stranger is in the room. Forgive women exchanged a look. We said no such thing. The taller one said in the way people say things when they mean the precise opposite. Is it near town? Eleanor asked. A pause. The shorter woman said despite herself. About 4 miles north. Can't miss the gate. It's got an H worked into the iron. Thank you, Eleanor said. She bought her flour and her salt, and she walked back to the boarding house and spent 20 minutes studying the road north of town before she made a decision. She made the decision the way she made most decisions, not because it was safe or certain, but because it was the only door that was still open, and she had never been a woman who sat down in the hallway. She arrived at the Hale Ranch at 1:30 in the afternoon, having talked the livery boy, after considerable negotiation, into lending her a cart for the cost of 2 biscuits from Mrs. Potts's kitchen. The gate had the H in the iron, just as the woman said. The drive leading up to the house was rutted, and the fence line needed mending, and the flower beds near the front porch were overgrown with a season's worth of neglect. The house itself was sound good, timber good bones, but it had the particular quietness of a place that had stopped being tended. Not abandoned, just waiting. She knocked on the door. The man who answered was not what she expected, though she would later be hard-pressed to say what she had expected. He was tall, very tall, with dark hair that needed a cut, and the kind of face that had been weathered not just by sun and wind, but by something internal, something that had been working on him for a long time. He wore work clothes, and he was carrying a hammer, which suggested she had pulled him away from something, and he looked at her with the wary, exhausted expression of a man who had been surprised by strangers in the past, and not always pleasantly. "Can I help you?" he said. It was not exactly a question. "My name is Eleanor Hartley," she said. "I arrived in Ash Hollow yesterday. I understand you might be in need of a cook and housekeeper. I'm offering my services." He looked at her. Then he looked past her at the cart and the livery horse. "Who told you that?" he said. "2 women at the dry goods store. They didn't mean to. They were discussing it between themselves, and I happened to be there." Something in his expression shifted not quite amusement, but adjacent to it. "And you just drove out here?" "I did. Without an introduction or a recommendation." "I don't know anyone in Ash Hollow well enough for a recommendation," she said. "And I'll be honest with you, Mr. Hale, because I suspect you're a man who prefers honesty. I arrived here yesterday expecting to be married, and that arrangement fell through in a rather public way. I have enough money to last 3 weeks. I am an excellent cook, a competent housekeeper, and I am not easily discouraged. I'm asking for a chance to be useful." Grayson Hale looked at her for a long moment. She held his gaze. She had learned not to look away. "Who told you my name?" he said finally. "The same 2 women." He stepped back from the door. Not all the way, but enough. "I haven't got much to pay," he said. "Room and board and what little I can spare at month's end. It's not what you're worth, probably." "It's what I need right now," she said. "That's enough." He nodded once the way men who are not accustomed to asking for help nod when they have asked for it anyway. "My father's in the back room," he said. "He doesn't talk much. Don't expect that to change." "I won't," she said. "Kitchen's in rough shape." "I've worked in rough kitchens before." Another pause. He stepped back the rest of the way. "Come in then," said Grayson Hale. And Eleanor Hartley picked up her bag and stepped across the threshold of a house that was not hers. In a town that had already decided it didn't want her carrying the wreckage of a plan that had never truly been her own. And somewhere underneath all of that, something in her went still. Not calm exactly, but still. The way a compass needle goes still when it finally points true north. The kitchen was as advertised in rough shape. She did not say this. She tied on her apron, which she had packed in the top of her trunk, with the forward thinking of a woman who had learned to be prepared for most things, and she looked at what she had to work with, and she began. She found onions in the cellar, and dried beans that were old, but not too old, and a smoked ham hock on a hook near the back wall, and potatoes that needed cutting away at their bad edges, but were sound at the center. She found salt and pepper, and a tin of dried herbs. she could not immediately identify, but which smelled of thyme and something close to sage. She found a cast iron pot that was heavy and well made and wanted only cleaning. She worked in silence, except for the sounds of the kitchen, the fire settling the knife on the board, the pot filling with water. The house was quiet around her. She could hear somewhere toward the back the occasional creak of a rocking chair. 2 hours later, the smell of the stew had moved through the entire house. She knew this because she had cooked enough long meals in enough quiet houses to know exactly when the smell reached its fullest, when the onions had gone sweet, and the broth had deepened, and the herbs had given themselves up entirely to the heat. When the kitchen no longer smelled like a kitchen and began to smell like a home. She had just started on the biscuits when she heard it. Slow footsteps in the hallway. Not Grayson's. She had already learned the weight and rhythm of Grayson's step from 2 hours of proximity. These were different. Slower, more uncertain. The old man appeared in the kitchen doorway. He was perhaps 70 thin in the way of men who have stopped remembering to eat with Grayson's same dark eyes gone a little pale at their edges with age. He wore a flannel shirt that had been neatly pressed at some point in the past, and had not been pressed since. He stood in the doorway and looked at the pot on the stove, and said nothing. Eleanor turned and looked at him, and said nothing either. She had learned that some silences wanted filling, and some silences wanted keeping. She spooned the stew into a bowl. She cut a biscuit from the pan. She carried it to the table and set it down and pulled out the nearest chair. She said without any softness or performance, "It's ready. Come sit down." Elias Hale looked at her. Something moved across his face. Something complicated and private, and not meant for other people, but she caught the edge of it anyway. He came to the table. He sat down. He picked up the spoon. He took one mouthful, then he was still for a long moment with the spoon in his hand. "Martha used to add sage," he said. His voice was rough from disuse, the way a door sounds when it hasn't been opened in a long time. "That's sage in there," Eleanor said. "Dried, but it's sage." He took another spoonful, then another. "Good," he said. That was all. But the words sat in the kitchen like something solid, like something that had weight and warmth. Grayson appeared in the doorway. He looked at his father at the table with a bowl of stew in front of him, and for a moment his face did something that Eleanor was careful not to see too directly, because it was the kind of thing that belonged to a man in private. He looked at Eleanor instead. Something passed between them, not a word, not a gesture, just a look. The kind that meant, "I didn't know that was possible." Eleanor turned back to the stove and stirred what was left in the pot. She had not saved anything not fixed, anything not solved anything. The town of Ash Hollow still thought what it thought. Dale Rourke was still behind his mercantile door. Her brother Victor was still wherever Victor was with whatever knowledge he was keeping from her. But in this kitchen, in this house, on this particular Wednesday evening, the stew was good, and the biscuits were warm, and an old man who hadn't spoken in years had said good to a woman who hadn't been called good in longer than she cared to remember. And that, for now, was enough to keep going. But the night was not finished with her yet. Because when she went to the porch for air after supper, she found a folded paper tucked under her bag, and when she opened it, the handwriting was Victor's, and the words were not what a brother writes to a sister. They were numbers. They were dates. They were the name Dale Rourke written 3 times, and beside the last instance in her brother's unmistakable hand the words "debt cleared upon delivery." She stood on the porch of a stranger's house in the cooling dark of a Kansas night and read those words twice, and then a third time, and understood in the particular way that understanding arrives when it is very unwelcome exactly what she had been in her brother's arrangement. Not a bride, not a person being given a chance at a life. A payment. She folded the paper. She put it in her coat pocket. She went inside. She washed the dishes. She banked the fire. She went to the small room off the kitchen that Grayson had indicated would be hers, and she closed the door. And then finally, alone in the dark, with no one to watch and nothing to perform, Eleanor Hartley put her forehead against the cool wood of the door and felt the crack inside her open a little wider. But only for a moment. Only a moment. Then she straightened up. She turned around. She sat on the edge of the bed. She had the paper in her pocket. She had her own 2 hands. She had a kitchen that was already cleaner than it had been this morning, and a table where an old man, and that was something she had done, something real. Something no one could take back. She would figure the rest out. She always did. She slept poorly that first night on the Hale Ranch. Not because the bed was uncomfortable. It was narrow, but clean, and she had slept in worse, but because the paper in her coat pocket kept pulling at her like a fishhook, and every time she drifted toward sleep, her mind went back to it. Debt cleared upon delivery. She would surface again, blinking at the dark ceiling, and lie there listening to the Kansas wind working itself around the corners of the house. By 4 in the morning, she gave up entirely. She dressed in the dark and went to the kitchen and built the fire back up and put water on, and sat at the table with the paper spread flat in front of her, and her hands wrapped around a tin cup, and she read it again in the growing light. It was not a long document. That was almost the worst part. The brevity of it, the way the whole transaction fit onto a single folded page. Dates going back 14 months. A figure $430 that appeared first beside Victor's name, and then later with a line drawn through it beside Dale Rourke's. A note in the margin in Victor's handwriting that read, "Terms agreed, verbal confirmed in letter delivery, expected spring." And then that final line, the one that had lodged itself in her chest like a splinter debt, cleared upon delivery. She was the delivery. She had been the delivery for over a year while she sat in Missouri, thinking she was waiting for a new beginning. Eleanor folded the paper, put it in her pocket, drank her coffee. She thought about Victor, her older brother by 6 years, the one who had managed the family's affairs since their father died, the one who had always seemed to know what was best, the one who had written to her last winter with the news that he had found her a match in Kansas. A good man, a merchant with a solid business, someone who would take care of her. She had believed him. She had been grateful even. Because 32 years old and no prospects in a world that measured a woman's value in a currency she had never been given enough of, that was a particular kind of loneliness, and Victor had seemed to be offering a way out of it. He had not been offering her a way out. He had been offering her as a way out. His way out. Out of $430 worth of debt to a Kansas merchant she had never met. She heard Grayson's footsteps in the hallway. She had already learned them, the particular weight and cadence of the man, and she smoothed her face and folded her hands around the cup, and by the time he appeared in the kitchen doorway, she looked like a woman simply drinking her morning coffee, which was close enough to the truth. He stopped when he saw her. He was already dressed for work, which told her he was up before sunrise as a matter of habit, not circumstance. "You're up early," he said. "I'm always up early," she said. "Coffee's ready." He came in and poured himself a cup and stood at the counter in the way of men who are not quite sure yet where they belong in a space that has recently changed. The kitchen was different from yesterday. She had reorganized it the evening before, after supper, quietly and systematically, the way she did most things. He was looking at the rearranged shelves with an expression she couldn't entirely read. "I moved some things," she said. "If you'd rather they were back the way they were." "No," he said. He took a sip of coffee. "No, it's fine. Martha always kept the flower near the window, too." It was the first time he had said his wife's name to her. She noticed this and did not comment on it. "I'll start breakfast in a few minutes," she said. "How many eggs?" "3. My father—" He paused. "He might not come out. He doesn't always." "If he doesn't come out, I'll take a plate to him," Eleanor said. "I don't need him to come to me." Grayson looked at her over the rim of his cup. That look again, the one that meant he was reassessing something, adjusting some prior conclusion. She had seen it yesterday evening when his father had spoken. She was beginning to recognize it as one of the few expressions he used freely. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I know I don't have to," she said. "I want to." He set his cup down. He picked up his hat from the hook by the door. "I'll be at the north fence line most of the morning," he said. "Section's been down since February. I've been patching it, but—" He stopped. "I'll be back by noon." "I'll have something ready," she said. He went out. She heard his boots on the porch steps, then the ground, then fading toward the barn. She sat for another moment in the quiet kitchen with her coffee and her thoughts and the paper in her pocket. Then she got up and began making breakfast. She brought a plate to Elias Hale's room at 7:30, knocked twice, and waited. Silence. She knocked again. "I've got eggs and biscuits," she said through the door. "I'll leave them here if you don't want company, but they're better warm." A long pause. Then, "Come in." The room was small and very tidy, tidier than the rest of the house, because this was the one space someone had maintained. There was a quilt on the bed that had been made with care, a rag rug on the floor that was worn but clean, a Bible on the nightstand with a ribbon marker, and on the dresser a framed photograph of a woman who had to be Martha Hale. She had a direct, clear gaze in the photograph, the kind of face that did not look away from things. And Eleanor thought, yes, that makes sense. Elias was sitting in the rocker by the window. He looked at the plate she set on the nightstand and said nothing. "I didn't know how you take your eggs," she said. "So I did them over easy. If you'd rather them another way, tell me tomorrow." He looked at the plate. He looked at her. "Rourke's woman came to see about the cooking work last fall," he said. "Grayson sent her away." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "I didn't know that." "He's particular," Elias said. "About who's in the house." He picked up the fork. "You made good stew last night." "Thank you." "Martha's was better," he said without cruelty. "Just fact." "I expect it was," Eleanor said. "She knew what you liked. I'm still learning." He looked up at her then. Something shifted in his expression, a small adjustment, like a man recalibrating. "You're the woman from the boardwalk," he said. Rourke turned away. She had not known he knew. She kept her voice even. "Yes?" "Rourke's a fool," Elias said. He said it the way he said everything plain without performance, as if it were simply a fact that had been established and needed only stating. Then he went back to his eggs. Eleanor went back to the kitchen and stood at the sink with her hands in the wash water and felt something move through her that was not quite gratitude and not quite grief, but some particular mixture of both that didn't have a proper name. By the end of the first week, she had established a routine, which was what she did in unfamiliar situations. She made order because order was controllable, and controllable things did not ambush you in the dark. Breakfast at 6:30. Elias's tray at 7:30. Midday meal at noon, when Grayson came in from the fields or the fence line, or wherever the ranch had sent him that morning. Supper at 6. Dishes banking the fire, and then her own time in the small back room with the paper, and her thoughts, and increasingly a worn notebook she had started filling with lists. The lists were her way of thinking. Always had been. She made lists of what she knew and what she didn't know and what she needed to find out. She made lists of names: Dale Rourke, Victor Hartley, and the people she had seen in Ash Hollow who might matter. She made a list of everything the paper told her, and a separate list of everything it didn't tell her, which was longer. What she didn't know, whether Victor was still in contact with Rourke. Whether Rourke had other such arrangements. Whether the document she had was the only document, or whether there were others. Whether any of this was actionable in a legal sense, and if so, by whom. And whether a woman like her, unmarried, newly arrived without connections, would be taken seriously enough for it to matter. What she did know, she had not been brought here as a bride. She had been brought here as a transaction. The man who was supposed to marry her had known the full terms of that transaction and had chosen to reject her publicly rather than quietly, which meant either he was cruel enough not to care how she was treated or arrogant enough to believe she had no recourse. She was going to prove him wrong on the second count. She was still deciding about the first. On Friday of that first week, she walked into Ash Hollow. She had reasons she needed thread, and Mrs. Potts at the boarding house had mentioned that Mr. Fenner at the dry goods carried a decent selection. But the real reason, the one she did not say aloud, was that she needed to see the town again without the shock of arrival coloring everything. She needed to see it with clear eyes. She tied the cart horse at the post outside Fenner's and went in and was selecting thread when the bell above the door rang and two women came in, and she recognized one of them. The taller woman from her first visit, the one who had said, "We said no such thing," while clearly saying something. The woman recognized her too. She stopped in the doorway. "Miss Hartley," she said. Her tone was carefully neutral, in the way that small-town neutrality often masks active curiosity. "Good morning," Eleanor said. "You're still here." It was not quite a question. "I am. I'm working at the Hale Ranch." The woman, she introduced herself somewhat reluctantly as Clara Briggs, wife of the town's only doctor, exchanged a look with her companion. "Grayson Hale hired you," Clara said. "He did." "Well," another exchanged look. "That's he hasn't had anyone out there since Martha passed." "So I gathered," Eleanor said. Clara Briggs had the expression of a woman doing several kinds of mental arithmetic simultaneously. "How is he?" "Working hard," Eleanor said. "His father's eating again." That landed. Clara Briggs blinked. "Elias is—" "He spoke to me on my first evening there," Eleanor said. Not to boast, simply because it seemed to be information Clara Briggs wanted, and because it was true. "He's a straightforward man. I like him." There was a pause in which Clara Briggs appeared to be revising something she had previously believed. "Dale Rourke came into our house for supper Tuesday last," Clara said, and Eleanor understood this was not a non sequitur, that it was in fact the real thing Clara had been building toward. "He told Robert, my husband, that you had arrived under false pretenses, that the arrangement your brother described was not the arrangement you presented." Eleanor set down her thread. She turned and looked at Clara Briggs directly. "Did he say what arrangement he believed had been described?" she asked. Clara hesitated. "He implied your brother had misrepresented your situation, in certain respects." "My situation," Eleanor repeated. "And what situation is that?" Clara's cheeks colored. "He didn't specify." "Of course he didn't," Eleanor said. She picked up her thread. She went to the counter and paid Mr. Fenner and turned back to Clara Briggs. "Mrs. Briggs," she said, "I came to Ash Hollow on the basis of a letter from Dale Rourke. I have that letter still. In it, he wrote that he looked forward to my arrival and that we would build something proper here. What was misrepresented and by whom is something that will become clear in time." She paused. "I hope you'll reserve your judgment until it does." She went out. The bell above the door rang. She untied the cart horse and climbed up and held the reins and sat there for a moment in the street, steadying herself. Across the street, the door of Rourke's Mercantile was open. She could see him inside behind the counter talking to a customer. He was laughing at something, a full, easy laugh, the laugh of a man entirely comfortable in his own domain. She looked at him for a moment. Then she clicked the horse forward and drove back toward the ranch. The second week brought rain, which trapped her and Grayson Hale inside the house together for long stretches of the day, and in this way she learned more about him than she might have otherwise. He was not a talkative man. She had established this. But he was not a silent man, either. There was a difference she had found between men who were quiet because they had nothing to say, and men who were quiet because they were always thinking, and Grayson Hale was the second kind. You could feel the thinking. It occupied space in a room. He fixed things when he had no outdoor work. The loose hinge on the kitchen cabinet she had mentioned only once, and in passing the stuck drawer in the parlor bureau, a cracked window frame, he replaced with such quiet efficiency that she only noticed it was done because the draft stopped. He worked the way she cooked methodically without announcement, with a kind of concentrated care that was in itself a form of communication. On the third day of rain, he came into the kitchen while she was making bread and sat at the table without particular explanation and watched her work, which might have been uncomfortable, but was not. "You knew what you were doing from the first day," he said eventually. She looked up. "Cooking. All of it," he said. "You walked in here and you looked at what needed doing and you just did it. No fuss." "Fuss doesn't get bread made," she said. "No." He was quiet for a moment. Martha was the same. She could look at a situation and see it plain. Eleanor worked the dough. She had learned to let him arrive at things at his own pace. "She died in the winter," he said. "Fever. Came on fast and—" He stopped. "My father found her. That's why he stopped talking. He found her in the morning and she was already gone, and he just... Another stop. He blames himself. He doesn't say so, but I know it. Do you blame yourself? Eleanor asked. The question surprised him. She could see it. I was in Dodge City, he said. I'd gone for supplies. I was gone 3 days. So you weren't here. Exactly. Then it wasn't yours to prevent, she said. He looked at her. Something in the look was almost sharp, not anger, but surprise at the directness. You don't know that, he said. I know that fever doesn't wait for the right person to be home, she said. And I know that blaming yourself for being in Dodge City is the same as saying you should have known something it was impossible to know. Silence. The rain on the roof, the bread dough under her hands. You're a frank woman, Grayson said finally. I've been told it's not always an asset, she said. I didn't say that, he said. I just said it. She glanced up and found him almost smiling. Not quite, not fully, but the face had relaxed in a way it hadn't before, and she thought, there you are. That is the man underneath the weathered surface. She looked back at her bread. She did not say anything. But something in the kitchen changed in those few minutes, some small shift in temperature that had nothing to do with the stove, and she felt it and thought, careful, Eleanor. You are in someone else's house. You are here because you had nowhere else to go. And careful is the word. But careful is not the same as closed, and she did not close herself off from it. She just noted it and kept working. It was Elias who found the second letter. He came to her on the Thursday of that week, appeared in the kitchen doorway in the afternoon, which was unusual. He had not sought her out in that way before. He was holding something. This came for you, he said. Boy from town left it at the gate this morning. I forgot to give it to you at breakfast. She wiped her hands and took it. The handwriting on the outside was Victor's. She opened it. Eleanor. I have heard you did not complete the arrangement. You have put me in a very difficult position. Rourke is not a patient man, and what is owed is still owed. I urge you to reconsider. There is another way this can be resolved that does not require. She stopped reading. She folded the letter. Elias Hale was still standing in the doorway, watching her with those pale, dark eyes. Bad news, he said. A letter from my brother, she said. Her voice was steady. She would credit herself that always the voice held. You have family back east. I have a brother, she said. Whether that constitutes family is something I'm still working out. Elias looked at her for a long moment. Then he did something she had not expected. He came fully into the kitchen, pulled out a chair, and sat down at the table. My brother cheated me on a land deal in 1867, he said. I didn't speak to him for 11 years. Eleanor looked at him. Did you ever? He died in 78, Elias said. Typhoid. We'd started writing letters again by then, but we never... He looked at his hands. We ran out of time before we figured out how to be brothers again. She sat down across from him. She put the letter on the table between them. Victor didn't just mismanage my situation, she said. She had not planned to say this. But Elias Hale was looking at her with the plain, patient attention of a man who was not going to flinch, and she was very tired of carrying it alone. He arranged my coming here as a financial settlement, for a debt he owed Rourke. I was the settlement. Elias was quiet for a moment. You're telling me he sold you, he said. He said it the way he said everything, flat and direct. No softening, just the thing itself. That's what the document says, she said. What document? She told him about the paper she had found tucked under her bag that first night. She did not take it out. She didn't need to. She had its contents memorized at this point. Elias listened. He did not interrupt. When she finished, he was quiet for a time. Does Grayson know? He said. No. You should tell him. I know, she said. She paused. I'm trying to understand what I have first, before I bring it to anyone else. What you have, Elias said slowly, sounds like evidence of fraud, depending on how the arrangement was structured. He looked at her. I was on the county land board for 9 years. I know what a fraudulent contract looks like." Eleanor stared at him. "You were on the land board. Until Martha died," he said. "I stepped away." He was quiet for a moment. "Show me the paper." She hesitated. Then she reached into her coat pocket and took it out and spread it on the table between them. Elias put on the pair of spectacles he pulled from his shirt pocket. He read the document slowly twice. She watched his face while he read the small adjustments in his expression, the slight tightening around his mouth at certain passages, the pause at the bottom line. He took off his spectacles. He folded them. He looked at her. "This is a promissory note," he said. "Structured as a personal debt agreement. Your brother used your arrival here, your person as collateral against the debt." He paused. "It's not legal, not in Kansas. You can't use a person as collateral." "Can I prove that in a way that matters?" she asked. "You have the document." "Rourke will say it's a forgery, or that I stole it. Do you have the letter Rourke sent you, the one inviting you here?" "Yes, I have it." Elias looked at the document again. "Then you have two pieces. That's more than most people start with." He folded his spectacles again, put them away. "You'd need Sheriff Callahan. He's an honest man, which is rarer than it ought to be. And you'd need someone Rourke can't simply dismiss." He said this last sentence in a particular way, and she looked up and found him looking back at her, and she understood. "You," she said. "I spent 9 years on that board," Elias said. "Rourke knows my name. He knows I know how documents work." He straightened in the chair the first time she had seen him sit fully upright. Something had come back into his face, something that had been absent since she arrived. "He won't find it as easy to wave his hand at this if I'm standing in the room." Eleanor sat with that, with the strange and specific feeling of an unexpected door opening in a wall you had stopped looking for doors in. "Why would you do that?" she asked. Elias looked at her steadily. "Because what was done to you is wrong," he said. "And because you made good stew." She laughed. She had not expected to laugh. But it came out of her, and she let it because it was real, and because Elias Hale looked fractionally pleased with himself for producing it, which was the most expression she had seen on his face since she arrived. The sound of boots on the porch steps cut it short. Grayson came in from the rain shaking water from his hat, and stopped when he saw his father sitting at the kitchen table. Really stopped the way a man stops when he sees something he has been afraid might never happen again. "Dad," he said. "Just the word. Your fence on the south pasture needs more than patching," Elias said. "It needs replacing. I've been meaning to tell you that for a month." He stood up from the table. "Supper smells good," he said to Eleanor, and walked back toward his room with a steadiness in his step that had not been there a week ago. Grayson watched him go. He stood in the doorway with the rain dripping from his hat and his face doing several things at once. Then he looked at Eleanor. She had the letter from Victor open on the table. She had been about to put it away when he came in, and she had not quite managed it. He looked at the letter. He looked at her. "Do you want to tell me what that is?" he said. And she looked at Grayson Hale. This man who had opened his door to her. This man who had not asked her questions. She wasn't ready to answer this man whose kitchen she had made warm and whose father she had brought back to the table, and she thought careful. And then she thought, but not closed. "Sit down," she said. "I'll tell you everything." He came in. He sat down. He set his hat on the table, and he looked at her and waited with the particular patience of a man who understood that some things needed to be said in their own time. And Eleanor began to talk. She told him about the paper she'd found that first night. She told him about Victor's letter, the new one with its thinly veiled pressure. She told him what Elias had said, the fraud, the promissory note, the collateral. She told him all of it plainly, and in order, the way she made lists without drama, and without minimizing, just the facts arranged so that a person could see them clearly. Grayson did not interrupt. He did not move. He sat with his hands flat on the table and he listened. When she finished, the kitchen was very quiet. "He sold you," Grayson said. Not a question. His voice had dropped to something very level, very controlled, the voice of a man keeping something carefully in check. "That's the plain reading of it," she said. "Your own brother." "Yes." He was quiet for a long moment. Then, "And Rourke." He knew. He agreed to this. "Yes." He stood up from the table, went to the window, stood there with his back to her, looking out at the rain. "Grayson," she said. He turned. "I'm not asking you to do anything about this," she said. "I want to be clear about that. I told you because you deserve to know what you have in your house, what situation I've brought to your door." She paused. "If you'd rather I went back to town, I understand that." He looked at her for a long time. "Is that what you think I'm thinking about?" he said. She held his gaze. "I don't presume to know what you're thinking about. I'm thinking," he said slowly and carefully, "that you walked into my house with evidence of a crime against you in your coat pocket, and you didn't say a word for 2 weeks because you were trying to figure out how to handle it yourself." He paused. "I'm thinking that is the most Eleanor Hartley thing I have learned about you so far." She did not know what to do with that. She sat with it for a moment. "Your father thinks Sheriff Callahan is honest," she said. "My father's right," Grayson said. He came back to the table. He did not sit down. He stood with his hands on the back of the chair and looked at her. "2 weeks ago, you knocked on my door with nothing but a bag and an apron and the nerve God gives to about 1 woman in 1,000, he said. "I am not sending you back to town. I am not—" He stopped. He pulled out the chair and sat back down. "Eleanor, I want to help you, if you'll let me." She looked at him for a long moment. This man, this house, this kitchen that smelled of supper and wood smoke, and the particular warmth of a place that has started to live again. She thought about how she had arrived here with nowhere to go, and nothing but her own 2 hands and a talent for making something good out of whatever was available. She thought about Elias at the table with his spectacles and his 9 years of land board experience. She thought about the letter in her pocket with its thin, dangerous pressure. What is owed is still owed. And she thought about Dale Rourke behind his counter laughing. "All right," Eleanor said. "Yes." Outside, the rain came down on the Kansas plains, steady and patient, and without mercy. Inside, the stew was ready and the fire was good. And for the first time since she had read that paper on the porch 2 weeks ago, Eleanor Hartley did not feel entirely alone with what she knew. That feeling, she would discover, was its own kind of dangerous. Because people who are no longer alone start to want things. They start to believe things are possible. They start to plan. And Eleanor had always been very, very good at planning. She told Grayson everything that night, and the telling of it changed something, not fixed. It not resolved it, but changed it the way a wound changes when it finally gets air. It still hurt, but it was no longer hidden, and hidden wounds are the ones that go bad. Grayson listened. He asked 2 questions the whole time she talked. The first was, "Do you still have both documents?" She said yes. The second was, "Does Rourke know you have them?" She said she didn't think so. He nodded at both answers and said nothing else until she was done. And then he said he needed to think, and she respected that because thinking before acting was the mark of a man worth trusting. She did not sleep well that night either, but it was a different kind of sleeplessness. Not the hollow drowning kind of the first night, but the active kind. The kind where the mind is working on something real. She lay in her narrow room and listened to the house settle, and she made lists in her head. What she had, what she needed, what order things needed to happen in. By morning, she had the shape of something. It was not yet a plan, but it was the skeleton of one. The next day, she wrote a letter. She did not write it to Victor. She had nothing to say to Victor that needed saying in a letter. What she had to say to Victor was better said in front of witnesses. She wrote instead to the county land office in Hays City requesting public records on the Rourke Mercantile Business Registration and any associated partnership or debt agreements filed in the last 3 years. She knew from the land board conversation with Elias that such records were public. She knew from her own careful thinking that Rourke would not have been careless enough to leave the arrangement with Victor. Entirely undocumented men like Rourke documented everything, because documentation was power, and they simply assumed the documents would never be used against them. She had Grayson post the letter when he rode into town for feed. She did not explain the full reasoning. She simply said, "I need these records and here is why." And he took the letter without question. That was the thing about Grayson Hale that she was learning slowly and with some difficulty, because she had not been accustomed to it. He did not require her to justify herself. She said a thing, and he believed she had reasons, and he acted accordingly. She was discovering a more radical form of respect than any she had previously encountered in a man, and she did not entirely know what to do with it except to be careful not to waste it. Clara Briggs came to the ranch on a Tuesday. Eleanor saw the buggy from the kitchen window and went to the door, and Clara Briggs climbed down with the slightly over-deliberate movements of a woman who has made a decision she is not entirely sure about but intends to see through regardless. "Mrs. Briggs," Eleanor said. "Miss Hartley." Clara stopped at the foot of the porch steps. She was carrying a covered dish which Eleanor recognized as the universal frontier currency of a social call that did not want to announce itself as an apology, but was one anyway. "I brought a pie. Apple." "Come in," Eleanor said. They sat at the kitchen table with coffee and the pie between them, and Clara Briggs talked around the real subject for about 4 minutes, which Eleanor allowed because some people needed the approach before they could make the landing. She talked about the weather and the state of the road north of town, and how her husband Robert said the Hale property always had the best-maintained kitchen garden in the county even now. Then she stopped and looked at her coffee cup. "I owe you an apology," Clara said, "for what I said in Fenner's store about Dale Rourke's version of events." "You were repeating what you'd been told," Eleanor said. "I was repeating it as though it were fact," Clara said. "Without knowing you, without—" She pressed her lips together. "Robert said I was unfair. He was right. He's irritatingly often right." "What made you change your mind?" Eleanor asked, not to be difficult, genuinely wanting to know. Clara looked up. "Margaret Rourke came to see Robert last week," she said. "Dale's wife." Eleanor went still. "She came to see your husband. The doctor. She came with a bruised wrist and a story about catching it in a door," Clara said. "Robert has been a doctor for 22 years. He has heard that story before." She paused. "It was not the first time she has come to him." The kitchen was very quiet. "How long?" Eleanor asked. "Robert wouldn't tell me specifics. Confidentiality." Clara wrapped both hands around her cup. "But he said he was worried, that the situation in that house was not good, and that he thought Dale Rourke was a man who needed to be brought up short before someone was seriously hurt." Eleanor set down her cup. She thought about Margaret Rourke. A woman she had never met had only a name for a woman married to a man who had publicly humiliated a stranger on a boardwalk without flinching. That kind of man. She understood now why it had not flinched him. "Mrs. Briggs," Eleanor said carefully, "how much do you know about the arrangement that brought me to Ash Hollow?" Clara hesitated. "Only what Dale told Robert, which was his version," Eleanor said. "Yes." Eleanor looked at her for a moment. Then she got up and went to her coat on the hook by the door and reached into the inside pocket and took out the folded document. She brought it to the table and laid it flat in front of Clara Briggs. Clara read it. The color in her face changed as she read. "Good Lord," she said softly. "My brother owed Dale Rourke $430, Eleanor said. "My brother arranged my arrival here as settlement of that debt. Rourke agreed to the terms. When I arrived and he decided I was not—" She paused. "Not to his standards, he rejected me publicly, rather than quietly, because a quiet rejection would have required him to acknowledge the arrangement, and the arrangement was not something he wanted on public record." Clara was still looking at the document. "This is fraud," she said. "I know," Eleanor said. "This is Eleanor. This is serious." Clara looked up. "Does anyone else know?" Elias Hale, Grayson. She paused. Now you. Clara straightened in her chair. She had the look of a woman whose moral compass had just pointed somewhere clear and unambiguous, and who was the kind of person to follow it. Robert needs to see this, she said. I know, Eleanor said. I've been waiting until I had more. You have this? Clara said. This is... It's my word, and a document that Rourke will immediately claim is forged, Eleanor said. I need the county records. I've written to Hayes City. I'm waiting. Clara looked at her steadily. What else do you need? And this was the moment Eleanor had not anticipated. Not the document, not Clara's reaction, not even the information about Margaret Rourke, disturbing as it was. This a woman she barely knew sitting across from her and asking plainly without agenda, what do you need? It was the kind of question that hit differently when you had spent weeks carrying something alone. I need someone who knows the town, Eleanor said, who people will listen to when the time comes to make this public. Clara nodded slowly. You have me, she said, and you have Robert. She left the pie. Eleanor ate a slice standing at the counter after Clara's buggy had disappeared down the road, and she thought about Margaret Rourke and her bruised wrist and the story about a door, and she felt the shape of the situation clarify in a new and urgent way. This was no longer only about what had been done to her. It was larger than that. It had been larger than that for longer than she'd known. The county records arrived 12 days later. Grayson brought the envelope from the post, and she was at the kitchen table when she opened it, and Elias had come in from his room without being called. He was doing that more often now, appearing in the kitchen at intervals, as though the house were gradually convincing him to inhabit it again, and she spread the papers on the table, and the three of them read. What the records showed was this: Dale Rourke had incorporated his mercantile under a partnership agreement in 1886, 3 years prior. The partner listed was a man named Gerald Pratt of Hayes City. The business had taken 2 substantial loans against property since incorporation, the second of which, dated 14 months ago, had been extended under unusual terms that required collateral in the form of personal guarantor agreements. Personal guarantor agreements, Grayson said. He was reading over her shoulder, which she had stopped noticing 2 days ago. What does that mean? It means, Elias said from the other side of the table with his spectacles on, that someone else signed on to absorb the debt if Rourke defaulted. Victor, Eleanor said. And others possibly, Elias said. Look here. He pointed to a notation at the bottom of the second loan document. There are 3 guarantor signatures. Your brother's name is one. The other 2 are initialed only W, B, and C, M. Eleanor stared at the initialed notations. He did this to others, she said. It appears, Elias said carefully, that Rourke has been using personal guarantors to secure business loans, and then when those guarantors cannot pay, calling on whatever arrangements he has made privately to satisfy the debt. He built a system, Grayson said. His voice had gone very flat. He built a system for trapping people. That's the reading, Elias said. Eleanor sat back. The full shape of it was coming clear now, and it was worse than she had thought. She had been thinking of this as her situation, her brother's debt, her arrival, her humiliation. But this was not one transaction. This was a pattern. Rourke had been running this for years, quietly, legally adjacent, using the gap between what could be proven and what was decent to operate in. WB, she said. CM. She looked at Grayson. Do those initials mean anything to you in Ash Hollow? He thought for a moment. Will Barker ran the feed store on the East End until 2 years ago. Then he sold up and left town. Nobody quite knew why. He paused. Carl Myers had the smithy. His wife left him, I heard. He's been running the business alone, barely making it. Will Barker and Carl Myers? Eleanor said. We don't know that, Elias said. We know enough to ask, she said. Grayson looked at her. Eleanor. I know, she said. I know it's more than I came here with. I know this has gotten bigger. She pressed her palms flat on the table. But if he did this to Will Barker and Carl Myers, the way he did it to my brother with me, or someone like me as the collateral, then those men's lives were changed by this the same as mine was. I cannot unknow that." The kitchen was quiet for a moment. "No, Elias." She drove herself. She had long since stopped asking permission for the cart horse, and Grayson had long since stopped offering it. And this was in itself a form of the relationship they were building, the way a fence gets built post by post without ceremony. She tied the horse outside the smithy and walked in. Carl Myers was a man in his mid-50s, with the particular look of someone who had been working alone too long, not broken, but worn like a tool that has been well used and not quite cared for. He looked up when she came in with the expression of a man expecting a customer. "Miss Hartley," he said after a moment, "I know who you are." "I imagine most people in Ash Hollow know who I am," she said. "Can I speak with you about something private?" He set down his hammer. He looked at her for a moment. Something in his face shifted a recognition she couldn't quite name, the look of a man who has been waiting for a particular kind of conversation without knowing he was waiting. "Come in the back," he said. They sat on upturned crates in the dim rear of the smithy, which smelled of coal smoke and metal, and the particular hard-working smell of a man's trade. And Eleanor told him directly without preamble that she had seen the county loan records, and she had seen his initials on a guarantor agreement attached to Rourke's business loan. Carl Myers did not deny it. He looked at the floor between his boots for a long moment. "He told me it was a formality," he said, "that my signing on was just to satisfy the bank's requirements. He said he'd never actually call on it." He paused. "Then, about 18 months ago, he came to me and said the loan payment was short, and I owed him what I'd guaranteed." "How much?" Eleanor said. $300. He said it the way men say figures that have been crushing them for a long time, flatly, without inflection, because the weight is so familiar now that the voice has nothing left to do. "I didn't have $300. I barely had 30. He knew that. He knew when he got me to sign." "What did he ask for in return?" Eleanor said. She thought she already knew. Carl looked up. "My nephew," he said. "He said my nephew owed him a personal debt, and if I didn't pay in cash, my nephew would have to work it off, at Rourke's store, for wages Rourke set." He paused. "My nephew's been working there for 16 months. Eleanor looked at him. "Is your nephew, does he want to be there? He's 21 years old, and he's working 12 hours a day for $4 a month, because his uncle put his name on a piece of paper." "He shouldn't have," Carl said. "No, he does not want to be there." She let that sit for a moment. "Carl," she said, "if I can show in front of witnesses, in front of Sheriff Callahan, that Rourke did this to you, to your nephew, to others, and to me, will you stand up and say what you just told me?" He looked at her for a long time. "Why would you do this?" he said. "After what happened to you on that boardwalk, why would you take on more?" "Because what he did to you is the same thing he did to me," she said. "Differently, but the same." She paused. "And because I seem to be the one who has the documents." Another long silence. Outside, a horse on the street. The distant sound of the general store's door. "If Callahan's involved," Carl said slowly, "if it's official, Elias Hale is willing to stand with us," Eleanor said. "He was on the county land board for 9 years. Rourke can't wave him away." Carl Myers looked at her. Then he nodded once, the way Grayson had nodded that first day, the nod of a man who has been carrying something alone for too long and has just been offered unexpectedly a hand. "All right," he said, "I'll stand up. Stand." She drove back to the ranch in the late afternoon, and the plains were wide on either side, and the sky was that particular Kansas sky that goes on so long, you feel small under it, and she let herself feel it. The smallness, the largeness of what she was trying to do, and then she set it aside because she did not have time for it. She had lists to make. She had a plan to finalize. Grayson was on the porch when she drove in. He was sitting on the top step with a cup of coffee and the look of a man who had been there a while. "How'd it go?" he said. "He'll stand with us," she said. "His nephew too, I think, when it comes to it." Grayson nodded. He looked at her, the full direct look he used when he was about to say something that mattered. "Eleanor," he said, "I went to see Sheriff Callahan today." She stopped. "You did?" "I did," he said. "I told him I had information about a fraud scheme involving Dale Rourke, and that I'd be bringing documentation to him within the week and requesting a formal inquiry." He paused. "He said he'd been waiting for someone to do that for 2 years. The breath left her. He knew. He suspected, Grayson said. He didn't have evidence. He couldn't act on suspicion alone. He looked at her steadily. "He can act on what you have, Eleanor. The document. The county records. Carl Myers' testimony. My father's knowledge of land law." He paused. He said, "Bring it all to him, and he'll look at every piece." She stood by the cart in the evening air and looked at Grayson Hale sitting on his porch step, this man who had let her into his house because she knocked when she had nowhere else to go. This man who had listened and then done the thing she had not quite gotten around to doing yet, and she felt something move in her chest that she did not immediately name. "You went to Callahan without asking me," she said. "I did," he said. "If that was wrong, tell me." She thought about it honestly for a moment. "It wasn't wrong," she said. "I was building to it. You just built faster." "I had a reason to move fast," he said. He said it simply looking at her, and she understood from his voice that the reason was her, and she stood with that for a moment and let it be what it was. "Grayson," she said carefully. "I know," he said. "I know what you're going to say." "Do you? You're going to say you're not in a position to that this is complicated, and that you came here without choices, and you don't want to make decisions from that place." He looked at his coffee cup. "Am I wrong?" She was quiet. "You're not wrong," she said. "All right," he said. He looked back up. "Then I'll say this, and then I'll stop because I'm not a man who says things twice." He paused. "When all of this is done, when you've got your feet under you and you've got choices again, I'd like to still be in the conversation. That's all." Eleanor looked at him. At the honesty in his face, the uncomplicated directness of it, the way it asked for nothing and stated only what was true. "That's all," she repeated. "That's all," he said. She tied up the horse. She went inside. She started supper. And in the kitchen, over the sound of the fire and the smell of coffee, and the distant creak of Elias's chair in the back room, she thought about choices. About what it meant to choose something when you had not chosen anything for a very long time. About the difference between gratitude and feeling, and how you were supposed to know the difference when you were standing in the middle of both. She thought about Grayson on the porch step, saying, "I'd like to still be in the conversation," with the straightforwardness of a man who had nothing to hide and no game to play, and was simply saying the true thing in the simplest possible words. She thought about Margaret Rourke and her bruised wrist and the story about a door. She thought about Carl Myers' nephew working 12-hour days for $4 a month. She thought about the document in her coat pocket and the county records on the kitchen table and the letter she had written to Hayes City that had come back with exactly what she needed. She stirred the pot. She cut the bread. She set the table for 3. Then something happened that she had not planned for, had not put on any list. She heard a horse coming up the drive, fast. Not Grayson, he was on the porch. Not a ranch horse. She went to the kitchen doorway. Grayson was already standing. His hand was at his side. The rider pulled up at the gate and called out a young man, maybe 16, breathing hard. "Mr. Hale," the boy called. "Mr. Hale, I got a message for the woman staying with you. Miss Hartley." Eleanor came through the door and onto the porch. "I'm Eleanor Hartley," she said. The boy held out a folded paper. His face was uncomfortable in the particular way of messengers who know they are carrying something unpleasant. She walked down the steps and took it. The handwriting on the outside was not Victor's. She did not recognize it. She unfolded it. "Miss Hartley, I am aware you have been making inquiries. I suggest you consider carefully what you stand to gain and what you stand to lose before you proceed further. You arrived in Ash Hollow with nothing. You can leave the same way. Dr." She read it twice. She folded it. She looked at the boy. "Who gave you this?" she said. "Mr. Rourke himself, ma'am. the boy said. "He come to my pa's house this evening and gave me a dime to bring it out." "Thank you," she said. She gave him a biscuit from the kitchen she had made extra that afternoon, which she was now glad of, and he rode back down the drive. She turned around. Grayson was behind her, close enough to have read the letter over her shoulder if he'd been inclined, but his eyes were on her face. She handed it to him. He read it. His jaw tightened. "He knows," Grayson said. "He's been watching," she said. "Or someone has been watching for him." She thought about Carl Myers's smithy, about Clara Briggs's buggy on the road from town, about the boy who had just ridden 4 miles with a dime in his pocket. Rourke had eyes, which meant he had time, which meant he was worried. Worried men made mistakes. "Eleanor," Grayson said. His voice had an edge she had not heard before. Not anger, but something close to it. Something that was about her, and about the note, and about the fact that Rourke had sent a 16-year-old boy to deliver a threat to a woman's door. "I know," she said. "We need to go to Callahan now, not within the week. Now." She thought about it, about timing, about what she had and what she still needed, about Margaret Rourke and whether there was time. "Tomorrow morning," she said. "First light. We go together, you, me, your father. We bring everything." She looked at him. "One night won't change it." "One night gives him time to—" "I know what one night gives him," she said. "But tonight I'm going to write down everything. Every name, every date, every figure in those documents. Everything Carl Myers told me written out in full, while it's clear in my head." She met his eyes. "If Rourke comes for those papers tonight, I'll still have the written account. Everything I know." Grayson looked at her for a long moment. "You think of everything," he said. It was not a compliment exactly. It was something closer to wonder and something closer again to the beginning of a feeling he had been careful about naming. "I make lists," she said. "It's what I do." She went inside. She got out the notebook. She sat at the kitchen table in the lamplight, and she wrote. She wrote for 2 hours while Grayson sat in the parlor, and Elias came out and sat across from her without speaking, which was his way of being present, and the house was quiet around them, and the Kansas night pressed against the windows. At 10 o'clock she closed the notebook. At 10 past 10, Elias Hale said without preamble, "In 31 years on this land, I have never seen a woman work the way you work." She looked up. "Martha worked like that," he said. "Eyes on the whole field, not just the row in front of her." He was quiet for a moment. "Grayson sees it too, in case you were wondering." "I wasn't wondering," she said. "Yes, you were," Elias said mildly. He got up from the table. "Good night, Eleanor." She watched him go. She thought about Martha Hale in the photograph on the dresser, that direct, clear gaze, the face that did not look away from things. She thought about the woman Grayson had lost, and the silence that loss had put in this house, and how the stew had been the thing that cracked it open. She blew out the lamp. She lay in the dark of her small room and listened to the house and thought about tomorrow. About Sheriff Callahan. About the documents. About Rourke's note, "You can leave the same way you arrived," and the cold certainty beneath it, the certainty of a man who had never once been held to account for the things he had done to people who had no one to stand with them. She was not those people anymore. Tomorrow she would show him the difference. She was up before the sun. She had the documents arranged on the kitchen table by the time Grayson came in. The original promissory note, the county loan records from Hays City. Victor's second letter with its barely concealed threat, Rourke's note delivered by the boy on horseback, and the notebook with her 2 hours of written testimony, every name and date and figure recorded in her clear, steady hand. She had stacked them in order of legal weight, which she knew because Elias had spent part of the previous evening explaining to her quietly and methodically which documents would matter most to a sheriff and which to a judge. Grayson looked at this table. He looked at her. "You didn't sleep," he said. "I slept some," she said. "Coffee's ready." He poured his cup and stood at the counter and looked at the stack of papers, and she could see him doing what he always did, taking in the full situation, not just the surface of it, thinking it through to its edges. "My father's coming," he said. I know. He told me last night. She paused. He said he was going to wear his good coat. Something moved across Grayson's face, brief and private and very close to grief, which she understood because a man whose father had stopped living for 3 years and was now getting out his good coat was not a small thing. Good, Grayson said. His voice was level. Good. Elias appeared in the kitchen at 6, wearing the good coat. It was a dark wool well-made, and he had shaved. He looked 10 years younger and 20 years more formidable. He sat at the table and drank his coffee without commentary, and Eleanor thought Rourke does not know what is coming into his store today. He simply does not know. They reached Ash Hollow at 8:30. The town was awake, but not yet fully into its day. Shopkeepers opening horses being tied a few early wagons on the street. Eleanor sat straight on the cart bench, with the documents in the satchel on her lap, and watched the buildings go past, and felt for the first time since she had arrived on that Wednesday stagecoach entirely clear. Not calm exactly. Clear. The way a sky goes clear after weather, everything sharper, every edge defined. Sheriff Callahan's office was at the north end of Main Street, a solid building with a front room that smelled of coffee and old paper and the particular institutional smell of a place where serious things were handled. He was behind his desk when they came in, and he looked up and his eyes went immediately to Elias Hale. Elias, he said. He stood. He was a big man, somewhere in his 60s, with a gray mustache and the steady gaze of someone who had spent decades deciding what to believe. God Almighty, it's good to see you up. Martin, Elias said. He shook the sheriff's hand. We've got something for you to look at. Callahan looked at Eleanor. Miss Hartley. He nodded. I heard you'd taken a position out at the Hale place. He said it without judgment, which she appreciated. Grayson came to see me. I know, she said. He told me. She sat down across from the desk and opened the satchel and began placing documents in front of him in the order she had determined. I'll walk you through these. She did. 15 minutes clear and methodical. No excess, no drama. Just the facts in sequence, the documents as evidence, the pattern, as she had reconstructed it. Callahan listened, the way she had hoped he would listen without interrupting, without the skeptical half-attention she had braced for, with the focus of a man who had been waiting for exactly this shape of information. When she finished, he sat back in his chair. Carl Myers, he said. Will you get him in here? He's willing to come, she said. I told him to be available this morning. Callahan looked at the promissory note. He looked at the county records. He looked at the notebook which he read through carefully while none of them spoke. The initialed guarantors, he said. W.B. and C.M. You believe those are Will Barker and Carl Myers. Carl Myers confirmed it himself, she said. I spoke with him 3 days ago. He told me the full arrangement, the loan, the signature, the terms Rourke imposed when he called in the debt. Barker's gone, Callahan said. Left town 18 months ago. Did he leave voluntarily? Eleanor asked. Callahan looked at her steadily. That's a question I should have asked at the time, he said. I did not. He was quiet for a moment. I had suspicions about Rourke going back 2 years. I want to be straight with you about that. I didn't have grounds. What you've brought me. He tapped the documents. This is grounds. There's one more thing, Eleanor said. She looked at Grayson, then back at Callahan. Margaret Rourke, Dale's wife. Callahan's expression did not change, but something behind his eyes shifted. What about her? She's been seeing Dr. Briggs, Eleanor said carefully. Regularly, for injuries that Dr. Briggs does not believe are accidental. She paused. Robert Briggs is prepared to speak to you directly. A silence. Lord, Callahan said quietly to no one in particular. He stood. He took his hat from the hook. He looked at Eleanor with an expression she would think about later. Not quite admiration, but something in that territory mixed with something that looked like the particular relief of a man whose conscience has been bothering him. I'm going to go get Carl Myers, he said, and then I'm going to pay a visit to Rourke's Mercantile. He paused. I'd like you to be there, all three of you. We'll be there, Elias said. They waited at Callahan's office while he went for Carl Myers. Grayson stood by the window, and Eleanor sat in the chair, and Elias sat at the side of the desk, with his hands folded and his good coat straight on his shoulders, and nobody said anything, because there was nothing to say that the morning didn't already contain. Carl Myers came in 15 minutes later, hat in hand, with the look of a man who has been afraid for a long time and is working very hard not to show it. He sat across from Callahan, and he told his story, the same story he'd told Eleanor in the smithy, but cleaner now, in proper sequence as a formal account. His voice only cracked once when he talked about his nephew, and he steadied it himself and kept going. When Carl was done, Callahan said, "Your nephew's still working at the store." "Every day," Carl said. "Not after today," Callahan said. He stood. "Let's go." They walked to Rourke's Mercantile, as a group, Callahan in front. Then Carl Myers, then Eleanor with the satchel, then Grayson, then Elias, and Eleanor was aware of the town watching. She had been the spectacle once before on this street alone, and stranded with a trunk at her feet. The configuration had changed considerably. She pushed open the door of Rourke's Mercantile and walked in first, because she had decided that weeks ago in her small room in the dark, that if she ever came back to this building, it would be through the front door on her own feet, and no version of this morning was going to change that. The store was doing its morning business. Two women at the dry goods counter, a man examining tools near the back, a young man sweeping who looked up with the automatic attention of a store employee, and then went still. He was young, early 20s, with Carl Myers' same dark eyes, the nephew. He looked at Carl, and something passed between them that needed no words. Dale Rourke was behind the main counter. He saw Callahan first, and then Carl Myers, and his face did what faces do when the thing a person has been managing finally comes through the door, a rapid sequence of calculations, all of them visible. Then he saw Eleanor. And for a fraction of a second, something else moved across his face. Something she could not name but recognized. The look of a man who had underestimated someone and had just arrived at that knowledge. "Martin," Rourke said. He came around the counter. He had his social face on, composed, easy, the face of a man of business. "What can I do for you this morning?" "Dale," Callahan said. "I need you to ask your customers to step out for a few minutes if you would." Rourke looked at him. "Is something wrong?" "I'd like to speak with you privately," Callahan said. "You and I and a few others." Rourke looked around the group. His eyes landed on Elias Hale and paused there. Something in his calculation shifted. Elias was watching him with the mild, patient expression of a man who has read a great deal of documentation. "Ladies," Rourke said, turning to the women at the counter, his voice smooth. "Would you mind giving us a few minutes? I apologize for the inconvenience." They went. The tool-browsing man followed. The nephew stayed because Carl Myers put a hand briefly on his arm, not restraining, just present, and the boy understood. When the store was cleared, Callahan said, "Dale, I'm going to ask you some questions, and I'd appreciate straight answers. I have documentation here." He gestured toward Eleanor's satchel. "That I've reviewed this morning, and that I believe warrants a formal inquiry." That. Rourke's social face had not moved. "What kind of documentation?" Eleanor opened the satchel. She took out the promissory note and set it on the counter between them. Rourke looked at it. He looked at it for a long time. When he looked up, his eyes went straight to Eleanor, and she met them directly and did not look away. "Where did you get that?" he said. "It was in my possession when I arrived," she said. "My brother was not as careful as you perhaps hoped. That document—" He stopped. He was thinking fast. She could see it. "That document is a private financial agreement between myself and Victor Hartley. It has nothing to do with—" "It has your name and my name and the words 'debt cleared upon delivery,'" Eleanor said. "I believe it has quite a lot to do with me. Victor Hartley described you as—" He caught himself. "As what?" Eleanor said. Her voice was very quiet. "Finish the sentence, Mr. Rourke. You're among people who'd like to hear it." He did not finish it. He turned to Callahan. "Martin, this woman is making allegations." "I'm looking at a document," Callahan said. "I'm also looking at county loan records from Hayes City that show your business carried personal guarantor agreements going back 14 months with signatures that correspond to 2 men in this town." He paused. "And I've had a conversation this morning with Carl Myers about what those guarantor agreements looked like in practice." Rourke looked at Carl. Carl met his gaze, did not look away. "Carl," Rourke said. His voice had changed. The social ease was gone now, replaced by something with an edge to it. "You don't understand the full picture. I understand I signed a piece of paper you told me was a formality," Carl said. "And I understand my nephew's been working in this store for 16 months for wages that wouldn't cover his boots, and I understand that was how you squared what you said I owed you." He paused. "I understand all of that real clear, Dale." Rourke turned back to Callahan. These are private business matters. Nothing here is illegal." "That's what we're going to determine," Callahan said. "Using a person as collateral against a debt is not legal in Kansas," Elias said. It was the first time he had spoken since entering the store. He said it the way he said everything plainly factually without heat, which somehow made it worse than anger would have been. "I spent 9 years on the county land board. I know what the statutes say." Rourke stared at Elias. There it was, the thing he had not accounted for. He had sent a note to a woman on a ranch thinking she was alone out there, thinking she had nothing but her own word and a piece of paper she could barely prove was real. He had not accounted for Elias Hale in his good coat. "Elias," Rourke said. His voice had changed again, something placating in it now. "You know me. You've known me for years." "I've known your name," Elias said. "That's not the same thing." And then the back door of the store opened. Everyone turned. Margaret Rourke stood in the doorway. She was a woman in her early 40s, thin in a way that went beyond constitution, with the careful stillness of someone who had learned to take up as little space as possible. She looked at Callahan first, then at the group, and her eyes moved to Eleanor, and stayed there. Eleanor had never met her. But she knew her the way you know someone whose situation you have been thinking about for weeks. She saw the careful stillness. She saw the way Margaret held herself, shoulders slightly drawn in chin, not quite level, the posture of a woman who had learned that the world was safer if you didn't appear to challenge it. She saw, because she was looking for it, the way Margaret looked at her husband. Not with love, not even with hatred. With the flat, watchful exhaustion of someone who has been managing a dangerous situation for a very long time. "Margaret," Rourke said. "Go back inside." Margaret did not move. "Mrs. Rourke," Callahan said carefully, "you don't have to go anywhere." Margaret's eyes stayed on Eleanor. "You're the woman from the boardwalk," Margaret said. Her voice was quiet, but not weak. "The one Dale turned away." "Yes," Eleanor said. A long pause. "I have letters," Margaret said. "In the house. Letters between Dale and a man named Hartley going back 14 months. She paused. "I've had them for 6 weeks. I didn't know what to do with them." The silence that followed had a quality Eleanor had experienced only a few times in her life. The particular silence of a room in which the thing everyone was circling has just landed in the center of the floor. Rourke took a step toward his wife. Callahan moved not fast, not dramatically, just definitively placing himself between them. "Dale," Callahan said. "One word. That was all." Rourke stopped. "Margaret," Eleanor said. She crossed the store floor until she was standing directly in front of the woman. Up close, the carefulness was even clearer, the way she flinched very slightly when her husband moved the way she recovered it. "You don't have to explain anything right now. You don't have to do anything right now, except are those letters somewhere you can get to them?" "They're in my sewing box," Margaret said. "In the house. Would you be willing to bring them to Sheriff Callahan?" Margaret looked at her. Really looked, searching for something, checking for something. Eleanor held her gaze and waited and did not rush it. "Yes," Margaret said. "I'll get them." Rourke said, Margaret, if you take one step toward that. Mr. Rourke. Grayson's voice came from behind Eleanor, quiet, very flat, the voice of a man who does not need volume to make a point. I'd recommend you stop that sentence where it is. Rourke turned. He looked at Grayson with a new calculation in his eyes, a man reassessing his position and finding it worse than he thought. You don't have any standing in this hail, Rourke said. I've got standing as a witness, Grayson said, and as a man who's been listening to you talk for the last 10 minutes. He paused. I'd sit down if I were you. It was not a threat. That was the thing about Grayson Hale that Eleanor had come to understand over these weeks. He was not a threatening man. He was simply a man who meant exactly what he said and did not say things he didn't mean. And in that particular situation, that quality was more formidable than any threat could have been. Rourke sat down on the stool behind his counter. He sat there with his hands on his thighs, and his face doing the work of a man accepting that the situation has moved beyond his management, and Eleanor watched it happen and felt something she had not entirely expected. Not triumph, not satisfaction exactly, but something quieter. Justice has a particular weight when you see it beginning. It does not feel like winning. It feels like something being put back into its proper place. Margaret came back 20 minutes later with a bundle of letters tied in kitchen twine. She handed them to Callahan. Her hands were steady. Callahan untied them. He read the first two quickly. He looked up. Dale, he said, I'm going to need you to come with me. Rourke stood up slowly. He looked around the room at Callahan, at Carl, at Elias, at Grayson, and then at Eleanor, at Amhin. She met his eyes. She did not speak. She did not need to. What needed to be said was already laid out on the counter in documents and letters, and 14 months of other people's lives. He walked out from behind his counter. He went with Callahan through the front door of his own store. Carl Myers put his hand on his nephew's shoulder. The young man, the one who had been sweeping when they came in, who had stood frozen through all of it, said something quietly to his uncle that Eleanor couldn't hear, and Carl said something back, and the nephew pressed his eyes shut for a moment and nodded. Eleanor stood in the middle of the store and breathed. Elias came to stand beside her. He was quiet for a moment. 14 months of letters, he said. She had them the whole time, Eleanor said. She was thinking about that, about Margaret keeping those letters in a sewing box for 6 weeks, knowing they mattered, not knowing who to bring them to, whether anyone would listen, whether the risk was worth it. She needed someone to show up, Elias said. Yes, Eleanor said. Grayson came and stood on her other side. He did not say anything, but he was there, which was its own kind of statement, and Eleanor felt it the way you feel a solid thing when you have been standing in uncertain ground. Elias, she said without looking away from the door Callahan and Rourke had gone through. Thank you. For today. I got out my good coat, Elias said. Seemed like the least I could do. Margaret Rourke was still standing near the back door where she had come in. She had the look of a woman who has just done the bravest thing she has ever done and is not entirely sure yet what comes next. Eleanor turned and crossed to her. Mrs. Rourke, she said, is there somewhere you can stay? Someone you can go to while this is sorted? Margaret blinked, as though the question someone asking where she would go, whether she would be all right, was not one she had been asked before. My sister, she said slowly. In Lawrence. That's a good answer, Eleanor said. You should go. I don't. Margaret stopped. She looked at Eleanor. You came here because my husband made an arrangement with your brother. Yes. And you're the one who... She stopped again. She seemed to be working through something. You didn't have to do this. You could have just... Left, Eleanor said. Stayed quiet. Yes. No, Eleanor said. I couldn't. Margaret looked at her for a long moment. Her eyes were dry. She did not seem like a woman on the verge of tears. She seemed like a woman coming slowly back to herself from a long way away. And it was a process that was going to take much longer than this morning, but this morning was where it started. Thank you, Margaret said. She said it the way you say something when thank you is the only word that fits, and it does not come close to covering what you mean. Go to your sister, Eleanor said. When they came out of the store, the street had people in it, the natural accumulation of a small town that knows something has happened and has arranged itself to observe the aftermath. Eleanor saw Clara Briggs near the post office. She saw Mr. Fenner in his doorway. She saw the woman in the yellow bonnet who had whispered behind her hand on that first Wednesday. She walked out onto the boardwalk and stood in the same place she had stood when Dale Rourke had looked at her and said, "I can't marry that." The same boards under her feet. The same street. Everything else was different. Clara Briggs crossed the street toward her. She looked at Eleanor's face and appeared to read it accurately. "Callahan has him," she said. "He's with Callahan," Eleanor said. "He hasn't been formally charged yet. That depends on the letters and what he can prove." She paused. "But it started." Clara nodded. Then impulsively, she reached out and put her hand briefly on Eleanor's arm. A small gesture. It mattered. Grayson came out behind Eleanor and stood beside her. He did not touch her. He simply stood there, which was enough. "What happens now?" he said. "With your brother." She had been thinking about this. Victor was still out there, still in Missouri, or wherever he had gone, still carrying the knowledge of what he had done, and apparently still believing he could pressure her into silence. He had miscalculated on that. He had miscalculated on quite a lot. "Callahan will want to contact him," she said. "As part of the inquiry." She paused. "When Victor finds out that Rourke is the one in a room with the sheriff and not me," she let that sit. "He'll have to make some choices." "What do you think he'll do?" Eleanor thought about her brother. She thought about the 14 months of letters in Margaret Rourke's sewing box. She thought about the boys on the saloon steps who had grinned at her on her first day in Ash Hollow. "I think he'll try to run," she said. "And I think that will tell Callahan everything he needs to know." The morning was moving forward around them, the town rearranging itself in the wake of what had happened the way water rearranges after something large moves through it. Eleanor watched it and felt the strange particular feeling of someone who has pushed a very heavy thing and seen it begin to move. It was not over. She knew that. There would be the formal inquiry. There would be testimony. There would be her brother's choices, whatever they turned out to be. There would be the question of what happened to Carl's nephew, and what had happened to Will Barker, and what the full shape of Rourke's scheme looked like once Callahan finished pulling on the threads she had handed him. There was still a great deal to do. But she was standing on the boardwalk in Ash Hollow, Kansas, on her own feet, with people on her side, and the man who had looked at her and said, "I can't marry," that was sitting in a room with the sheriff. And Eleanor Hartley had not left, had not stayed quiet, had not allowed herself to be the only casualty of a scheme that had been built on the assumption that people like her women, like her people without connections, without standing, without anyone to stand with them, would have no recourse. She had found recourse. She had made it the way she made everything from whatever was available with her own two hands, one careful step at a time. Grayson said quietly beside her, "You hungry?" She almost laughed. "Yes," she said. "Actually, yes." "Nettie's opens at 9, he said. "Let's get your father," she said. They went to find Elias, who was standing outside Callahan's office with his good coat and his straight back, and the expression of a man who has done a satisfying morning's work, and the three of them walked down the main street of Ash Hollow together and went in for breakfast. And the town watched them go and began slowly to understand that it had been wrong about Eleanor Hartley. Most towns eventually do. The question is always, what happens before they get there? Breakfast at Nettie's lasted 2 hours. Not because the food was slow. Nettie ran a tight kitchen, and the eggs and biscuits came out fast and hot. But because Elias Hale, once started, turned out to be a man with a great deal stored up. He talked about the county land board. He talked about cases he had seen, documents he had reviewed, the particular ways that men with money and standing had historically arranged things so that people without those advantages had no clear path to justice. He talked with the methodical precision of a man who had spent 9 years learning a system and 3 years sitting in a back room, letting it go to waste. And Eleanor listened, and heard in his voice something she recognized, the sound of a person coming back to themselves. Grayson listened too, mostly the way he did everything with his full attention and very few words. He refilled his coffee twice. He ate his breakfast. Twice she caught him looking at her across the table with that particular look, the one she had cataloged and filed, and was trying very hard not to read too much into. And both times he looked away without embarrassment, which was somehow worse than if he had been embarrassed about it. They drove back to the ranch in the late morning. The plains were wide and bright, and the sky was doing what Kansas skies do when they are trying to remind you how small you are, which Eleanor usually found challenging, and today found almost companionable. She sat on the cart bench beside Grayson with Elias in the back, and the road unrolled ahead of them, and nobody said anything for a long stretch. Then Elias said from the back, "That went well." "It's not done yet," Eleanor said. "No," Elias agreed. "But the part where nobody believed you, that part's done." She thought about that. About the specific texture of not being believed. Not the dramatic disbelief of open accusation, but the quieter kind. The kind that lives in the slight pause before someone responds to you, in the way people's eyes slide past. Instead of landing in the assumption that a woman in your situation, with your history, arriving the way you arrived, simply cannot be the credible one in the room. That kind, the kind she had been living inside since the moment she stepped off the stagecoach, was done. Callahan had believed her, and Elias had believed her before that in a kitchen over a promissory note, and Clara Briggs had believed her, and Carl Myers and Margaret Rourke with her bundle of letters. And Grayson, the very first night she told him, had not asked a single question that doubted her word. That part was done. She pressed her hands flat on her knees and looked at the road ahead and let herself acknowledge quietly and without performance that this mattered. That it was not a small thing. The formal inquiry began 4 days later. Callahan had been thorough. He had written to the county seat in Hays City the same afternoon they'd come to him, and the response had been faster than Eleanor expected, which told her that whoever was at the county seat had also been waiting for something to come from Ash Hollow. The county sent 2 men, an attorney named Bram Sellers, thin and precise, who carried 2 leather cases and spoke in complete sentences that contained no unnecessary words, and a land law specialist from the state surveyor's office named Hugh Cole, who was older, heavier, and had the look of a man who had seen every variety of document fraud the state of Kansas had produced in 30 years. They set up in the back room of Callahan's office and worked for 3 days straight. Eleanor was called in on the first day in the afternoon. She brought the notebook. She sat across from Sellers and Cole, and she answered every question directly and without embellishment. And when they asked to see the original documents, she produced them in the order she had established. And when they asked about the chain of possession, how she had the note when she had found it, what she had done with it, since she walked them through it precisely. Sellers looked up from the note at one point and said, "You've had this for weeks." "Yes," she said. "You did not immediately bring it to the sheriff." "I needed to understand what I had first," she said. "And I needed to build a record that could not be dismissed by a single denial." He looked at her for a moment. He made a note. "You anticipated a denial," he said. "I anticipated everything," she said. "I had time to think." Cole, the land specialist, was the one who found the 3rd layer. He found it on the 2nd day, late going through the county records Eleanor had obtained from Hays City, and he brought it to Callahan that evening, and Callahan brought it to Eleanor and Grayson the following morning at the ranch. He sat at the kitchen table with his hat in his hand. A man who had known both Hale men for years, who had ridden out here in all weathers with all manner of news, and who still looked. Eleanor noticed slightly uncomfortable being the bearer of this particular information. "The Pratt Partnership," Callahan said. "Rourke's business partner, Gerald Pratt of Hays City." "I saw his name in the records," Eleanor said. "Gerald Pratt is Dale Rourke's brother-in-law," Callahan said. "Margaret's brother." A silence. "Margaret didn't know," Grayson said. "She says she didn't." Cole believes her. Callahan paused. But here's the thing. Pratt has been funneling money out of the partnership for 2 years. He's been drawing on the business loans, the ones your guarantors helped secure, and moving funds to a private account in Topeka. He paused. Rourke didn't know that either. Eleanor looked at him. Rourke was being defrauded by his own partner. Appears so. Which is why the payments kept coming short, she said. It was clicking into place, the pattern she had seen in the county records, but hadn't been able to fully explain. Rourke was calling in debts from people like Carl Myers because his own accounts were short, because Pratt was draining them. That's what Cole thinks, Callahan said. It doesn't excuse what Rourke did. The guarantor arrangements are still fraudulent, and the way he called them in is still extortion, and the arrangement with your brother is still... He stopped. What it is. But it adds a dimension. Where is Pratt now? Elias asked. He had come in from his room when he heard Callahan's horse, which he was doing reliably now, appearing when things mattered, which was a different man than the one who had sat in a back room for 3 years. Hayes City still, Callahan said. Cole sent word. He won't be going anywhere. Eleanor sat with all of this. The layers of it. Rourke's fraud. Pratt's counter-fraud. Victor's opportunism, the people caught between all of these moving parts without any knowledge of the machine they were trapped in. Carl's nephew sweeping floors for $4 a month. Will Barker gone from town. Margaret keeping letters in a sewing box. And herself. Deliver it as payment for a debt incurred by a man who trusted the wrong partner and tried to make up the shortfall from people who had nothing to do with it. Victor, she said. Has he responded? Callahan looked at her carefully. We sent a letter to the last address you had for him. We've had no reply. He paused. A telegram to the county sheriff in that jurisdiction came back this morning. Your brother left his lodging 3 days ago. He ran, she said. She had told Grayson he would. She had been right. She did not find this satisfying the way she had expected to. It's not this doesn't help him, Callahan said. Running makes a thing worse, not better in the law's view. Sellers has issued a warrant. I know, she said. I know that. Grayson was watching her. She could feel it, that particular quality of attention. He had the kind that did not press. He's still your brother, Grayson said, quietly. Not forgiving Victor, just naming what was true. Yes, she said. He is. She looked at her hands on the table. I've been angry at him since the first night I read that paper. I expect I'll be angry at him for a long time. She paused. But I've stopped waiting for an explanation that makes sense. There isn't one. He needed money, and he used what he had, and what he had was me. She looked up at Callahan. What happens to him depends on what he does next. That's not my decision. Callahan nodded. He stood. He put his hat back on. Sellers will want you again tomorrow, he said. And I believe he wants to talk to Margaret at some point if she's willing. She's still in town at the hotel. She hasn't gone to Lawrence yet, Eleanor said. She says she wants to see it through, Callahan said. He paused at the door. She said, and I'm quoting her because I thought it was worth quoting, she said, I have been a bystander in my own life for long enough. He looked at Eleanor. I believe she meant it. After he left, the kitchen was quiet for a moment. Then Elias said, That woman has more backbone than anyone gave her credit for. Most people do, Eleanor said. They just need someone to show up first. She went to see Margaret that evening. The hotel room was small and tidy. Margaret had the particular tidiness of someone who had been controlled for a long time and had learned to manage the things she could. She had tea, on which Eleanor accepted, and they sat across from each other in 2 chairs that the hotel had positioned with the best light, and for a while neither of them said very much. Then Margaret said, He wasn't always like that. I want you to know, I know that's not an excuse. You don't have to explain him to me, Eleanor said. I know I don't. Margaret wrapped her hands around her cup. I've spent years explaining him to myself, to my sister, to Robert Briggs. She paused. I kept those letters because I found them by accident, and I read them, and I knew what they were, and I just couldn't. She stopped. You weren't ready, Eleanor said. I was afraid, Margaret said. The word came out clear and direct, with none of the apology that usually accompanies that kind of admission. I was afraid of what would happen after. I didn't know what after looked like. What does it look like now? Margaret was quiet for a moment. Like my sister's house in Lawrence, she said. Like a room that's mine and a door I can open when I want to. She paused. Like something I have to build, but that I can build. She looked at Eleanor. How did you know? When you came to Ash Hollow with nothing, how did you know you could build it? Eleanor thought about this honestly. I didn't know, she said. I knew I had to try. There's a difference. Margaret nodded. Something in her face settled. Not relief exactly, but a kind of quiet resolution. The look of someone who has found a piece of information that fits. She left for Lawrence 2 days later, after giving her full testimony to Sellers. Eleanor stood outside the hotel and watched her go, and she thought, there goes a woman who is just now beginning. And some beginnings look like endings for a long time before they show themselves for what they are. The inquiry took 2 weeks in total. Sellers was meticulous. He interviewed Eleanor 3 times, Elias twice, Carl Myers and his nephew Clara Briggs. Robert Briggs, 2 of the county's land records officials, and Gerald Pratt, who had been located in Hayes City and was considerably less calm about the proceedings than Dale Rourke, who had maintained a cold, contained composure throughout that Eleanor found in some ways more unsettling than agitation would have been. On the 14th day, Sellers called Eleanor into the back room of Callahan's office and laid the summary of findings on the desk between them. The promissory note between Victor Hartley and Dale Rourke, Sellers said, has been determined to constitute a fraudulent personal agreement under Kansas statute, specifically the prohibition against use of a person as financial collateral. This finding is not a criminal conviction that requires further proceedings, but it is a formal legal determination that the agreement was invalid and unenforceable from the date of its creation. He said it in his precise, complete sentence way, and Eleanor listened to every word. The guarantor agreements between Rourke and Carl Myers, and the agreement we believe existed between Rourke and Will Barker, based on the documentary evidence, are similarly being reviewed under extortion statutes. He paused. Carl Myers' nephew is released from any obligation to continue his employment at the Mercantile effective today. We've already informed him. Good, Eleanor said. Rourke will face criminal charges, Sellers said. The fraud, the extortion, potentially additional charges related to Gerald Pratt's activities since questions remain about Rourke's knowledge of and participation in Pratt's fund diversion. He looked at her. Your name appears in a fraudulent document. You are formally cleared of any wrongdoing or any obligation arising from that document. She had known this was coming, had known since the morning in Rourke's store that the direction of it was right. But hearing it stated formally in a room with a law officer across a desk was different from knowing it. It had a different weight. Victor Hartley, she said, when he's found. He'll face charges, Sellers said. I won't minimize that. He was a party to the fraud. He paused. His cooperation if and when he's located will affect the proceedings. But the warrant stands. Eleanor nodded. She sat with that for a moment. Her brother, wherever he was running from something he had made, and that was now larger than he'd intended. She felt the anger again, its familiar shape, and underneath it, something sadder and more complicated that she suspected she would be living with for a long time. Thank you, she said to Sellers, for the thoroughness. You gave me something to be thorough with, he said. Without your documentation, Miss Hartley, we had suspicion. With it, we had grounds. He paused, and something in his precise face relaxed very slightly. You did good work. She went back to the ranch. It was late afternoon when she drove through the gate with the H in the iron, and the light was the particular Kansas afternoon light that comes in low and turns everything amber, and the house looked the same as it always did. Solid sound the flower beds near the porch that she had been quietly working on for the past 2 weeks, coming in with small determined color. She tied up the horse and went in through the kitchen door and stood in the kitchen that had become over these weeks as familiar to her as any room she had lived in. And she set down the satchel and put water on and stood at the counter and thought about what came next. What came next was a choice, a real one made from solid ground, not from necessity or fear or the absence of alternatives. Sellers' words had made it official, but she had felt the ground solidifying under her feet for weeks, with each conversation, each document. Each morning she had gotten up and done the work, and found herself still standing at the end of it. She had choices now, real ones. She could leave Ash Hollow. There was nothing holding her here, not obligation, not need, not the absence of anywhere else to go. She could go back to Missouri, or to Hays City, or to anywhere a woman with her competence and her nerve and her very good cooking could find a foothold. The world was not generous to women in her position, but it was not entirely closed either, and she had proven to herself that she knew how to work with whatever door was open. Or she could stay. Not because she had to, because she wanted to. She was still thinking about this when Grayson came in from the south field, and she heard his boots on the porch steps, and he came through the kitchen door and stopped when he saw her standing at the counter with the water not yet boiling, and the satchel on the table. He read her face the way he always did, quickly and accurately, and without pressing. "It's done," he said. "The inquiry's done," she said. "Formally cleared. Rourke faces charges. Victor." She paused. "Victor's still being looked for." Grayson nodded. He hung up his hat. He went to the counter and poured himself water from the pitcher, and for a moment they were both just standing in the kitchen, which was the room where most things had happened between them, the real things, the honest things. "Grayson," she said. He looked at her. "You said weeks ago that when all of this was done and I had my feet under me, you'd like to still be in the conversation." She paused. "Do you remember that?" "I remember," he said. "I meant it." "I know you meant it," she said. "That's why I'm asking about it now." She looked at him directly. "I have my feet under me. I have choices. Real ones, not just the absence of alternatives." She paused. "I want to be clear about that, because I need you to know I am not staying because I have nowhere to go. I've been nowhere to go before. That's not what this is." He was very still. "What is it?" he said. His voice was careful, not guarded but careful, the way you are careful with something that matters. "This ranch," she said. "This kitchen. Your father." She paused. "You." She let that sit for a moment in the room where they had talked and cooked and argued once about the fence repair, and sat across from each other over documents that were going to change both their lives. "I'm telling you, I want to stay. Not as a housekeeper, as whatever this is that we've been building without saying what it was." Grayson set down his water glass. He turned fully to face her. "I knew the morning you drove up to this door in a borrowed cart," he said, "that something was different." He paused. "I didn't say so because I thought you had enough to carry without me adding to it." "You weren't adding to it," she said. "I know that now," he said. "I've known it for a while." He took one step toward her, just one that measured deliberate step of a man who is certain of what he's doing. "Eleanor, I'd like to stay in the conversation for a considerable time, if you're amenable." She almost smiled. "Amenable," she said. "I'm not a man of speeches," he said. "I know," she said. "I've noticed that about you." "Then you know what I mean when I say—" He paused. "You walked in here with nothing, and you rebuilt this house. Not just the kitchen, not just the food. You gave my father back to me. You gave me back a home that had been empty." He stopped. "I know what you did. I know what it cost you. And I know you'd have done it whether I was here or not because that's who you are. But I'm glad I was here." She stood there in the kitchen where she had spent weeks making something from whatever was available, and she looked at Grayson Hale, who was the least complicated good man she had ever encountered, and she felt something in her chest that was the opposite of a crack. Something that was closing up and settling and becoming whole. "Then stay in the conversation," she said. "I'd like that." He nodded once. Then slowly, deliberately, with none of the performance of a man showing off and all the intention of a man who means something, he tipped his hat to her. It was such a small gesture, The most Kansas, most frontier, most completely Grayson Hale thing he could have done. And it hit her somewhere behind the sternum, and she thought, yes. This particular man in this particular kitchen. This is what choosing feels like when you do it right. Elias appeared in the doorway. He looked at the two of them, at whatever was written on both their faces, and he said nothing. He came to the table, pulled out his chair, and sat down with the expression of a man who has been waiting patiently for something to happen and is privately satisfied that it has. "Is supper on?" he said. "It will be," Eleanor said. "Good," Elias said. He settled into his chair. "I've been thinking about that stew again, the one you made the first night." "I can make it again," Eleanor said. "I know you can." He picked up the salt shaker and looked at it and set it down. Martha used to say that you could judge a house by whether it smelled like cooking. If it did, there were people in it who cared. He paused. "This house smells like cooking again." Eleanor turned to the stove. She began. The formal charges against Dale Rourke were filed the following week. Gerald Pratt's separate fraud case moved to the county court in Hays City. Victor Hartley was located in late October in Abilene by a deputy following the warrant. He did not resist. Eleanor received a letter from Sellers informing her of this, and she read it at the kitchen table in the morning before anyone else was up, and she sat with it for a long time. She wrote Victor a letter. It was not long. It was not forgiving. She was not ready for that, and she had decided she was not going to pretend to be things she was not ready to be because she had spent enough of her life doing that. But she wrote it, and she meant what was in it, which was this, that she did not hate him, that she understood desperation, even if she could not excuse what desperation had made him do, and that whatever came of the legal proceedings was between him and the law and not between the two of them. That was a separate accounting, and it would take longer, and she was not going to rush it. She sealed the letter. She set it aside to post. She made breakfast. November came in cold, and the ranch settled into the particular winter rhythm of a working property. Shorter days, longer evenings, more time inside. Elias began spending his afternoons at the kitchen table with his old land board documents, which he had brought out from somewhere in his room, reviewing cases, and making notes that Eleanor suspected he was going to do something with in the spring. He had written twice to the county seat already, both times with careful documented observations about specific statutes that Cole's inquiry had surfaced. He did not say what he intended to do with this, but the light had come back to him fully, the particular light of a man who has found a use for himself again, and Eleanor understood that what she had made room for in this house was not just Elias Hale's appetite and his voice, but his purpose. Carl Myers's nephew. His name was Thomas, she learned. Finally, Thomas Myers, 21 years old with his uncle's eyes and a quiet, watchful quality that would probably serve him well once he had room to use it, came out to the ranch one Sunday morning to thank her. He stood on the porch with his hat in his hands, and he said he didn't know what he would have done if she hadn't, and he stopped there because he seemed unable to identify the end of that sentence. "You'd have figured something out," Eleanor said. "People do." "Maybe," he said, but this was faster. She gave him coffee and biscuits, and he sat at the kitchen table with Elias for an hour, and by the time he left, Elias had offered to look over the documents his uncle had signed to see whether there was a legal basis for recovering the wages Thomas had lost. Thomas left with his hat on straight and something in his step that had not been there when he arrived. Clara Briggs came out on a Tuesday with another pie cherry this time and stayed for 3 hours, and by the end of it, she and Eleanor had the shape of something that neither of them named yet, but that both of them knew was a friendship. The real kind, built on honesty and specific difficulty, and the particular respect that comes from watching someone do a hard thing well. "Robert thinks you should have been a lawyer," Clara said on her way out. "I've been told I'm too direct," Eleanor said. "Robert says that's exactly why," Clara said. Margaret wrote from Lawrence. The letters were short, at first careful, the letters of someone learning to take up space on a page. Then they grew. She was living with her sister. Her sister had a small business, a hat shop. Margaret was helping with the accounts, which she turned out to be good at, which she had not known before because she had not been given room to discover it. She wrote, "I have been thinking about what you said, that you didn't know you could build it, only that you had to try. I am trying. Some days, it does not feel like building, but I get up again." Eleanor wrote back every time. On a Sunday in late November, Grayson asked her to walk the south fence line with him. This was not unusual. She had been walking the ranch with him for weeks, learning the property the way she had learned the kitchen, systematically and with attention. But there was something in the way he asked, a particular quality of careful intention that she recognized. They walked the fence in the cold morning air, checking posts and wire, and for a while they talked about the work, the sections that needed replacing before spring, the drainage issue near the east pasture, the equipment situation that Grayson had been putting off addressing since Martha died, and that could not be put off another season. Then they stopped at the far corner of the south pasture, where you could see the whole of the property laid out: the house, the barn, the outbuildings, the kitchen garden in its winter dormancy, the gate with the H in the iron. Grayson looked at it. "My grandfather built this," he said. "He came out from Ohio with nothing, and he built this out of nothing, that's not so different from what you did. Arriving here with nothing and building something." He paused. "I've been thinking about that." "What have you been thinking?" she said. He turned to her. He had his hat in his hand. He had taken it off in the cold, which was not a practical decision, which meant it was a deliberate one. He was looking at her with the full, direct, unguarded look that she had come to understand was his version of complete honesty. "I'd like to ask you something," he said. "And I want you to know before I ask it that there is no wrong answer, and I mean that. If the answer is not yet, I'll wait. If the answer is no, I'll respect it." "Grayson," she said, "ask." "Will you stay?" he said. Not in the arrangement we've been in, but as a partner in this life." He paused. "Will you marry me, Eleanor, if you want to?" The Kansas cold was sharp around them, and the land was wide, and the house in the distance had a thin line of smoke from the kitchen chimney, where Elias had been keeping the fire fed since morning, and she stood in the south pasture of the Hale Ranch, with this man who had opened his door to her, who had believed her word, who had gone to the sheriff one step ahead of her, and tipped his hat, and said, "I'd like to stay in the conversation," and meant it every time he said anything at all. She thought about wanting, about the difference between needing something and wanting it, about what it meant to choose from solid ground. "Yes," she said. "I want to." He put his hat back on. He held out his hand, not dramatically, just the hand offered steady. She took it. They walked back to the house together across the winter land, and Elias was in the kitchen when they came in, and he looked up from his documents, and he looked at their faces, and he said nothing at all for a moment. Then he said, "I'll need a better chair if I'm going to be at this table permanently." "I'll see to it," Eleanor said. "Good," Elias said. He put his spectacles back on. "The stew tonight." "The stew tonight," she said. She tied on her apron. She went to the stove. She built up the fire and found the onions and the dried beans and the smoked meat. And she began the same way she had begun that first evening, with whatever was available, making something good from it. But it was not the same. The hands were the same. The skill was the same. The kitchen was the same kitchen. But the woman standing in it was different. Not softened, not diminished, not fixed by what had happened to her, but expanded by what she had done with it. She had come to Ash Hollow as someone else's transaction, and she had become, through her own work and nerve and will, the one thing no one had planned for her to be herself. Fully, finally, on her own terms. The lantern in the kitchen window came on at dusk, the way it did every evening now, and its light fell out across the porch and the yard and the road that led back to Ash Hollow, and anyone on that road in the winter dark could see it from a long way off, warm and steady and unapologetic. It was not a signal. It was not a message. It was simply what happens when a house is truly lived in. The light comes on, and it stays on, and it does not ask permission to shine. Eleanor Hartley had come to Kansas with nothing, and she had built everything. Not because she was rescued, not because the world turned generous, but because she refused to be only what had been done to her, and that refusal, steady and quiet and absolute, had been enough to change everything it touched.